The Bench and the Boy Who Stayed There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to powerful men who've outlived their power. It doesn't look like grief. It doesn't ask for sympathy. It sits upright on a park bench in a decent coat, eyes half closed, and lets the world walk past. Watching, always watching, to see what people do when they think no one is paying attention. Arthur Callaway had been running this experiment for 2 years. He called it, to himself and to no one else, The Bench. He had 17 locations across Chicago's public spaces: Grant Park, Millennium Park, the long stretch of benches along the Riverwalk, a few in Lincoln Park near the conservatory. He rotated them. He wore the same coat every time, a good wool overcoat, well cut but not flashy, the kind a retired professor might wear. He left his wallet half visible in the outer breast pocket. His phone, an older model, not his real one, sat on the bench beside him, screen facing up. He closed his eyes. He breathed slowly, and he waited. In 17 tries, he had seen people hesitate. He had seen people look around as though checking for witnesses. He had seen one man, a man in a business suit who should have known better, actually reach for the wallet before a nearby jogger turned the corner and he pulled his hand back and kept walking. Arthur had watched all of it through the thin gap of his eyelashes, and each time he drove home afterward in the back of the car that Henry, his driver, kept idling 2 blocks away, he felt the cold, satisfying weight of being right. He had told himself, somewhere around the 4th or 5th test, that he wasn't doing this out of bitterness. He was conducting an inquiry. A man in his position had to understand the material he was working with. You didn't build a 40-year company on assumptions. You verified, you stress-tested, you confirmed. But here is what I think Arthur Callaway could not say out loud, even to himself. He wasn't testing strangers. He was replaying one specific afternoon, 3 years earlier, when he'd woken up in a hospital room with a tube in his arm and realized that while he was unconscious, his son had moved on his shares. He would keep replaying it until something stopped him. On the afternoon of October the 14th, Arthur settled onto the 3rd bench from the northern fountain in Grant Park. The trees had gone amber and rust, and the wind off the lake had the kind of clean bite that makes Chicago feel like the edge of something. He positioned himself, coat, wallet, phone, and let his chin drop toward his chest. The bench was in mild traffic. People walked dogs, pushed strollers, joggers passed in clusters of 2 and 3. He had been in position for about 22 minutes when he heard the footsteps slow. He kept his breathing even. He heard the soft, flat sound of a backpack being set on the pavement. Then the bench shifted slightly. The small weight of a child sitting down at the far end. Arthur waited. He did not open his eyes. He heard the child open a zipper, the papery rustle of what might have been a book or a worksheet, and then a long silence in which nothing happened. The child did not touch the phone. The child did not touch the wallet. The child, as far as Arthur could determine, was simply sitting there doing homework. He allowed himself a fraction of an inch, just enough to see. The boy was small, somewhere between 8 and 10, wearing a navy blue hoodie with the hood down and a backpack propped against his sneakers. He had a worksheet on his knee and a pencil he kept tapping against his thumbnail, the way kids do when they're not quite reading what's in front of them. He was looking sideways at the wallet. Arthur watched the boy's hand move, watched the fingers close around the edge of the wallet, just the edge, just for a moment, and then watched the hand stop. The boy looked around the bench, to the left, and then to the right, and then down at the wallet, and then at Arthur's face. Arthur stayed perfectly still. The boy set the wallet back exactly where it had been, straightened it with one finger so the corner aligned with the edge of the pocket, and then turned back to his worksheet. He picked up his pencil. He did not touch the wallet again. Arthur's heart was doing something irregular that had nothing to do with his condition. About 6 minutes later, a man approached from the northern path. Mid-40s, heavy coat, eyes moving. He slowed when he got within 8 or 9 feet of the bench. He was looking at the phone. He was looking at it with the focused, calculating attention of someone who had already run the math on whether the area was crowded enough. The boy on the bench looked up from his worksheet. He looked at the man. He did not say anything. He just looked. The direct, uncomplicated stare that children deploy when they haven't yet learned that staring is considered rude, or when they've decided that, in this specific situation, the social rule doesn't apply. He shifted his weight slightly forward, the way someone shifts their weight when they want their presence to be noticed. The man looked at the boy. The man looked at the phone. The man walked away. The boy watched him go all the way around the curve of the path and out of sight. Then he looked at Arthur. Then he looked at his worksheet. Then he reached over and shook Arthur's arm, gently, twice, the way you wake someone when you're not sure you're allowed to. "Mister," he said. His voice was matter-of-fact. Not urgent, not trying to be impressive, just a kid reporting what had happened. "There was a man looking at your stuff. I waited until he left." Arthur opened his eyes. He looked at the boy for a long moment. The boy looked back at him without flinching. Dark eyes, the smear of pencil graphite on the side of his hand, a small piece of tape holding one strap of his backpack where it had begun to come apart at the seam. On the front pocket of the backpack, pinned through the fabric, was a small round badge the size of a quarter, bronze-coloured. The image on it was a stylized globe, Art Deco lines, a design Arthur recognized from somewhere he could not immediately place. "Thank you," Arthur said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He hadn't used it much that day. The boy nodded, already looking back down at his worksheet. "It's okay," he said. "I wasn't doing anything anyway." Arthur sat up properly. He looked at the badge on the backpack for another moment. A globe with those particular lines. He knew that logo. He had approved that logo himself in 1987 for the company's first major infrastructure project in Asia. It was the Callaway Infrastructure Group Employee Achievement Pin, the kind they handed out at the annual review banquet when someone's project performance exceeded targets. He hadn't seen one in years. They discontinued the program in the early 2000s. He opened his mouth to ask about it. Then he closed it. The boy finished a problem on his worksheet, erased something, rewrote it. "What's your name?" Arthur asked instead. "Marcus," the boy said without looking up. "Webb." "How old are you, Marcus?" 9.5. He said it the way 9-year-olds do, the half mattering very much. "Do you come to this park often?" Marcus glanced up at him sideways. "I wait here on Tuesdays and Thursdays until my dad gets off. He works over on Michigan." He looked back at his worksheet. "You should put your wallet in your inside pocket, the zipper one. It's safer." Arthur looked at the boy for a moment, in which something in his chest, some mechanism he had believed was permanently seized, made a sound like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time, shifting on its hinges. "You're right," Arthur said. "I'll do that." He did not do that. He sat on that bench for another 20 minutes, talking to Marcus Webb about nothing in particular. About the worksheet, which was long division. About whether the squirrels in Grant Park were fatter than squirrels in other cities. About whether the building across from the park was taller than the one next to it, or if it just looked that way. When a man in a blue work jacket came down the path at 4:45, and Marcus stood up and swung his backpack on and said, "That's my dad. Bye, mister." Arthur watched them walk away together, the man ruffling Marcus's hair, Marcus saying something that made his father laugh, the small bronze badge catching the last light before they turned the corner. Arthur sat alone on the bench for a while after they left. The wind off the lake had gotten colder. He found that he didn't want to move. He finally called Henry at 5:15. While he waited, he did something he hadn't done during any of the previous 17 tests. He stayed on the bench and thought about the boy, rather than cataloguing what the boy had done. He thought about the moment Marcus's fingers had closed around the wallet. That part had happened. Arthur was not going to pretend it hadn't, or sand it down into something more flattering. The boy had picked it up, or nearly picked it up, and then put it back. And Arthur knew, from 17 sessions of watching people do the calculation behind their eyes, that the difference between picking something up and putting it down was not a small difference. It was, in fact, the only difference that mattered. But what settled into Arthur more heavily was the other thing: the man on the path. Marcus had not flagged Arthur down immediately when the man appeared. He had not made a noise or called out. He had simply sat there, a 9-year-old boy with a pencil and a math worksheet, and positioned himself as a witness. He had made his presence known not by speaking, but by looking. The quiet, steady act of making someone understand that they were seen. Arthur had spent 2 years testing strangers' honesty. He had not expected to be moved by someone else's courage. He pulled out his real phone and searched the name. James Webb, Chicago. The results were thin. A Facebook profile with a profile picture too small to read clearly. A mention in a local auto shop's review page. Jimmy did great work on my transmission, fair price, came in on time. A brief LinkedIn profile with 3 jobs listed over 15 years. 2 positions at commercial vehicle repair shops. One earlier listing that simply read, Callaway Infrastructure Group, Fleet Maintenance Division, 2006 to 2010. No reason given for the departure. Arthur stared at that line for a long time. Callaway Infrastructure Group, Fleet Maintenance, 2006 to 2010. He would have been running the company then. He would have had nearly 600 employees in that division alone. He did not remember a James Webb. He would not have been expected to. But something about the badge, the discontinued achievement pin, the one they'd only given to employees whose performance reviews exceeded targets, sat with him like a splinter that had gone in sideways. You didn't get one of those pins because you showed up. You got one because someone above you had written your name on a form that said above expectations and meant it enough to submit it through 3 levels of HR and have it approved and engraved and handed to you at a banquet with applause. And then, 4 years later, you were gone. And your son, 9 years old on a Tuesday afternoon in Grant Park, had your badge on his backpack because it was the last good thing the name on it had ever meant to your family. Or maybe not. Arthur did not know that. He was inferring. He had always been good at reading a room, and he had always paid for that skill by sometimes reading things into rooms that weren't there. But the question had lodged itself somewhere between his 3rd and 4th rib, and he could feel it with every breath. Henry arrived. Arthur got into the back seat. He looked out the window at the park as they pulled away, the bench empty now, the fountain still running, the trees going dark in the early evening October light. "Long afternoon, Mr. Callaway?" Henry asked. "Different," Arthur said. Henry nodded and didn't press. He had worked for Arthur for 11 years and had developed the particular skill of useful silence. They drove north. Arthur held his phone and did not look at the LinkedIn profile again. But he did not close the tab either. He looked at the city instead. The streets he had helped reshape over 4 decades, the infrastructure his company had laid under the surface and over it, the bridges and transit systems and commercial buildings whose bones bore the mark of decisions he had made. He had built things that would outlast him by 100 years. He had a son who had moved on his shares while he was unconscious. He had a 9-year-old stranger who had sat on a bench and waited until a threat walked away. Arthur thought, I don't know what any of this means yet, but I'm going to find out. That was, in retrospect, the most honest thing Arthur Callaway had said to himself in 3 years. Not a conclusion, not a verdict, just an admission that the inquiry was not over. That maybe, for the first time in a long time, it had actually just begun. He arrived home at 6:10. He ate dinner alone, as he did most evenings, at the kitchen table with a file from his desk and a glass of water he barely touched. He told himself he would not think about the boy again until he had more information. He thought about the boy all through dinner. At 9:15, he called his personal attorney, a careful man named Roland Fitch, and asked him to run a background check. Not the kind that dug up old trouble. The other kind, employment history, residency, whether a James Webb of Chicago had any significant legal or financial matters of record. Standard due diligence, the kind Arthur had run on everyone he'd ever considered bringing into his professional life. Of course, Roland said. Timeline? No rush, Arthur said. He paused. End of the week, he added. He went to bed at 10. He lay in the dark for a long time looking at the ceiling, which was the same ceiling he had been looking at for 30 years, and thought about a small bronze badge pinned to the front pocket of a second-hand backpack, catching the last light of an October afternoon. He had approved that pin design himself, back in 1987. He remembered the meeting. The marketing team had wanted something more modern, more angular, and Arthur had said no. He wanted it to feel like something worth keeping. Something a person might hold on to for years. He hadn't thought about that decision since. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep well. The man behind the badge. The background check Roland delivered on Friday was 11 pages long and entirely ordinary. James Daniel Webb, 41 years old, Chicago native, single father. One son, Marcus James Webb, age 9. Mother deceased, cancer 6 years prior. No criminal record. No outstanding debt beyond a manageable credit card balance and a car payment on a 2017 pickup truck. Current employment, self-employed, licensed mechanic, operating under the name Webb Mobile Auto Repair, out of a rented bay in a garage on South Wabash. Annual income, variable. Lower than it should have been for someone with his certifications. Prior employment history matched the LinkedIn profile. The Callaway Infrastructure Group entry read simply, Fleet Maintenance Division, Senior Technician, May 2006 to March 2010. Separation, involuntary termination. Roland had attached a note at the bottom. Records from that period are in archived storage. If you want the specifics of the termination, I'll need to submit an internal records request. Could take 2 to 3 weeks. Do you want me to proceed? Arthur wrote back, yes, proceed. In the meantime, he went back to Grant Park on Tuesday. He told himself he was simply verifying, making sure the boy was safe, that the situation was what it appeared to be. He brought a book he did not read and sat on the same bench at 3:40, and at 4:12, Marcus Webb appeared on the path with his backpack and his worksheet and sat at the other end of the bench as though it were a perfectly ordinary thing to do. You came back, Marcus said, without looking up from immediately opening his backpack. I was in the neighborhood, Arthur said. Marcus glanced at him sideways with an expression that suggested he had an opinion about that explanation, but had decided not to offer it. Okay, he said. They sat in a silence that was, Arthur noticed, not uncomfortable. Marcus worked on a reading comprehension worksheet. Arthur watched the park. Once, a man with a large German shepherd walked past, and Marcus tracked the dog with his eyes until it was out of sight, with the focused longing of a child who wanted a dog very badly and had probably been told the apartment wasn't the right situation for one. Do you like dogs? Arthur asked. Yeah, Marcus said. Then, after a moment, we can't have one right now. Why not? Dad says when things are more stable. He said it with the careful neutrality of a child repeating a sentence they've heard many times and understand more than the adults assume. Arthur looked at the boy. Things have been unstable for a while. Marcus shrugged, which was the answer of someone who had learned that shrugging was safer than saying yes. He turned a page on his worksheet. I want to stop here for a moment, because that shrug carried more weight than it looked like it did. Marcus Webb was 9 years old and already fluent in the particular language of children who have learned to make the adults around them feel less guilty about things they cannot fix. He knew that saying, yeah, things have been pretty hard, would make Arthur, this stranger on this bench, feel obligated or uncomfortable. And Marcus had intuited, with a precision that took some adults their whole lives to develop, that the way you protect your dignity when you have very little is by not asking for the pity of people who have a great deal. So he shrugged. And Arthur, who had spent 40 years in rooms full of people who said less than they meant, heard exactly what the shrug said. The next Tuesday, Arthur brought 2 cups of hot chocolate from the cafe on Michigan and set one on the bench beside Marcus without comment. Marcus looked at it. He looked at Arthur. He picked it up. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," Arthur said. That was all. But something had shifted. The bench felt different now, less like a test site and more like a regular arrangement between 2 people who had agreed, without ever discussing it, to occupy the same few feet of public space twice a week. Over the following weeks, Arthur learned things. He learned that Marcus's favorite subject was science, but he was better at math. He learned that Marcus wanted to be either an engineer or a baseball player, and when Arthur asked which he was leaning toward, Marcus said seriously, "I'm keeping both open," in a tone that suggested he had considered the career diversification strategy carefully. He learned that Marcus's father worked long hours and sometimes had to stay late, and on those days Marcus sat on the bench for an hour or 2 longer than usual, doing homework and not complaining about it. He also learned, carefully over time, in the way you learn things from a child who is simultaneously very open and very guarded, something about Jimmy Webb. "My dad's really good at fixing things," Marcus said one Thursday, with the particular pride of a boy who has had to defend his father's profession more than once. "Like engines and stuff. He can hear what's wrong before he even opens the hood." "That's a real skill," Arthur said. "He had a better job before," Marcus said. Then he seemed to think about whether he should have said that. "I mean, he liked his old job more. He doesn't talk about it much." He pulled the zipper on his backpack halfway up and halfway down, a small fidget. "He has this." He touched the badge on the front pocket. "From that job. He said it was for doing good work." Arthur looked at the badge. Up close, the engraving was still clear. The Art Deco globe, and below it, in small letters, Callaway Infrastructure Group. Excellence in service. "It looks like it meant something to him," Arthur said carefully. "Yeah." Marcus zipped the pocket shut. "He keeps it. He doesn't keep a lot of stuff." A pause. "We move sometimes. You kind of figure out what's worth carrying." There's something I keep coming back to in that sentence. The way Marcus said it, matter of fact, not sad, just true. You kind of figure out what's worth carrying. A child's version of a philosophy that most people don't develop until they've been broken down and rebuilt at least once. Jimmy Webb had apparently been broken down and rebuilt. And the one thing he'd decided was worth carrying from his time at Callaway's company was a small bronze badge that said he'd done good work. Arthur drove home that evening and sat in his study and looked at the wall for 45 minutes. He met Jimmy Webb for the first time on a Saturday in November, 3 weeks after the first bench encounter. He arranged it carefully, not by staging another coincidence, but by asking Marcus if his father ever brought the truck in for a coffee break nearby, and Marcus saying, "Sometimes he comes to the park on Saturdays if he's not working," and Arthur simply being there on that Saturday, on that bench, at 10 in the morning. Jimmy Webb was a lean, quiet man with the hands of someone who worked with them every day. Careful hands, clean despite the work. The kind of hands that moved with purpose and without waste. He was 39 but looked a year or 2 older in the way that people who carry weight without complaining tend to. He had Marcus's same direct eyes, and when Marcus introduced Arthur, "This is the man from the bench, Dad. I told you about him." Jimmy looked at Arthur with an expression that was polite and measured and not particularly warm. "James Webb," he said, and shook Arthur's hand. "Arthur Callaway," Arthur said. He watched for recognition. There was none. The name Callaway to Jimmy Webb was either unknown or neutral. That too told Arthur something. They talked for 20 minutes while Marcus explored the area around the fountain. The conversation, the ordinary kind, between 2 adults making cautious assessments of each other. The weather, the neighborhood, Marcus's school. Arthur asked obliquely what kind of work Jimmy did. "Mechanic," Jimmy said. "Mobile. I go to where the vehicles are." He said it without apology, but also without elaboration. The tone of a man who had learned that offering context invited follow-up questions he didn't want to answer. "Good work," Arthur said. "Hard to find people who are good at it." Jimmy looked at him for a moment. "I had a real job once," he said, and the flatness of his voice put a wall around the sentence that was not unfriendly but was absolutely a wall. "Didn't last, but I still know what I'm doing." He looked out at Marcus, who was trying to balance on the edge of a low stone border around a flower bed. "He's doing good in school," Jimmy said, changing the subject with the practiced ease of someone who changed it there many times before. "He's a good kid." "He is," Arthur said. "He looked out for me the first time I met him." Jimmy glanced back at Arthur. "He told me." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the place where a smile would be. "He said you needed to put your wallet in the inside pocket." "He was right," Arthur said. Jimmy almost smiled. He usually is. Over the course of the winter, Arthur moved carefully. He did not announce what he was doing or why. He called in a favor from a contact at a fleet management company and arranged for Web Mobile Repair to be on their service call list. Not charity, legitimate work, competitive rates, the kind of reliable pipeline contract that a one-man operation could actually build something on. He paid Marcus's school fees for the spring semester through the school's anonymous benefactor program. He spoke to Roland about the archived records, which had not yet come back. He told himself he was simply addressing a situation he had become aware of. He was a man with resources, and a boy had done him an unexpected kindness. The response was proportional. He told himself that. But here is the thing about Arthur Callaway that anyone who worked with him for more than 6 months came to understand. He did not do anything without a reason, and he never had only one reason. He was fixing what he could see of the situation, yes, and he was also, quietly, without saying so, waiting to understand what he couldn't yet see. The records came back in January. Arthur read them in his study at 11 o'clock at night with a glass of scotch he didn't touch. They were 4 pages, a summary of the performance review period leading up to Jimmy Webb's termination in March 2010, a copy of the termination notice and the HR approval chain. The stated reason for termination was repeated failure to meet safety protocol standards, resulting in 3 documented incidents over a 14-month period. Arthur read the 3 incidents. He read them again. He pulled up the fleet maintenance safety standards from that era. He still had access to the company's records archive and cross-referenced. The incidents were real. A safety log entry not filed on time, a pre-service checklist left incomplete, a parts requisition form routed through the wrong channel. All of them were paperwork failures. None of them were mechanical failures. None of them had resulted in any actual safety event, near miss, or equipment damage. He looked at the performance review from 6 months before the termination. The review that had accompanied the Achievement Pin Award read, "James Webb continues to be one of the most reliable and technically skilled members of the fleet maintenance team. His mechanical assessments are consistently accurate, and his turnaround times are 20% above division average. Recommended for senior technician classification and annual excellence recognition." Arthur set the papers down. He picked up the approval chain sheet for the termination notice. The immediate supervisor had flagged the incidents for review. The division director had escalated to VP level for termination approval. The VP's signature on the termination approval was Derek Callaway. Derek had been a VP at the company starting in 2008. Arthur had put him there himself. Arthur sat with that piece of paper for a long time. His scotch got warm. The house was quiet in the way that large houses are quiet late at night. A specific, almost pressurized silence. He picked up the scotch and took one sip, which was all he'd wanted of it. Then he put the papers back in the folder and put the folder in his desk drawer and sat in the chair for another hour, not moving. He knew he had a decision to make. Not tonight, not yet. But he knew it was coming, the way you know certain weather is coming even when the sky still looks clear. His son had fired an excellent employee through 3 manufactured paperwork violations and signed his name to the termination. Jimmy Webb had kept the achievement pin. And Jimmy's son had sat on a bench and waited for a stranger's threat to pass. Arthur looked at the folder in the drawer for a long moment. Then he stood up, turned off the desk lamp, and went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. It was February before Derek made his first appearance in the story's periphery. He called on a Wednesday evening, the call itself unremarkable. Derek called every few weeks, the obligatory check-in of a son who had decided that regular contact was the most efficient management of his father's expectations. The calls lasted between 8 and 15 minutes. They covered Arthur's health, the company's quarterly direction, and Derek's own activities in the order of Derek's priority. "I heard you've been spending time in the parks," Derek said toward the end of the call. Arthur paused. "Henry mentioned it?" "I called the house. Elena mentioned you'd been out." "I've been getting air," Arthur said. "Good." Derek's voice was steady. It was always steady. It was one of the things Arthur had once admired about him and now found difficult to read. "You should. The cardiologist said." "I know what the cardiologist said." A short pause. "I also heard you've been using Roland for some kind of records research. Internal records." Arthur said nothing for a moment. Roland would not have told Derek that, which meant Derek had other channels, which meant he was, as he always had been, paying attention to his father's activities with the particular attention of someone who had learned that his father's activities had consequences for him. "It's nothing that concerns you," Arthur said. "I didn't say it did," Derek said. "I just want to make sure you're not taking on stress you don't need to. You had a significant cardiac event 18 months ago. The doctors are very clear about—" "Derek," Arthur kept his voice level. "I appreciate the concern. I'll be in touch." He ended the call. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment afterward. Derek's voice, always so reasonable, always so controlled, had carried under its surface tonight something Arthur recognized the way you recognize a weather pattern you've lived through before. His son was not worried about Arthur's health. His son was worried about what Arthur might be finding. Arthur opened his desk drawer and looked at the folder inside. "There are things I haven't looked at closely enough," he had said, to no one. He would say it out loud, eventually. But not yet. Not yet. He closed the drawer. He looked at the window, at the city lights refracted through the winter glass, and thought about a man who kept a small badge in the years after the company that gave it to him had taken away his livelihood. He thought about what it meant to hold on to proof that you had once been excellent, when the institution that recognized that excellence had decided to pretend it never happened. He thought about how heavy a small thing could be. Everything he almost said. 3 years is not a short time. 3 years is long enough to learn someone's rhythms, their silences, their sharp edges, the way their face changes when they're tired versus when they're genuinely okay. 3 years is long enough for what starts as a cautious arrangement to become, without anyone deciding it would, a fact of daily life. By the time Marcus Webb turned 12, Arthur Calloway was a regular fixture in his world, in the way that certain adults become fixtures for children. Not family by any legal or biological fact, but present in that particular consistent way that ends up meaning more than a dozen irregular visits from people who share your blood. He came to Marcus's school science fair in March of his 4th grade year, sitting in the back row of the gymnasium with a paper cup of terrible coffee, watching Marcus explain his project on bridge load distribution with the specific animated seriousness of a boy who had, at some point, developed opinions about suspension cables. Arthur had not told Marcus he was coming. When Marcus spotted him from across the gym, the look on the boy's face was not surprise. It was something closer to the quiet satisfaction of a person who had privately hoped for something and is relieved to find they didn't hope wrong. He attended the 5th grade spring concert, where Marcus played a reluctant clarinet in the back row of the school band, and afterwards said, in the car on the way to the diner they'd started going to on occasion, "You don't have to come to these things, you know." "I'm aware," Arthur said. "Dad says you come because you want to." "Your father is correct." Marcus considered this for a block or two. "Okay," he said finally, the single syllable carrying the weight of a much longer sentence. I'm going to trust that this is real, even though I'm not sure why yet, and if you stop showing up, I'm going to have had to make that decision for nothing. So I hope you know what you're doing. Arthur heard every word of it. Jimmy Webb remained the more complicated relationship. He was grateful, genuinely, visibly so, for the changes in his professional situation. The fleet management contract had stabilized things considerably, and he'd taken on an apprentice the previous fall, the first time he'd had enough work to justify it. He was proud in the way of a man who has clawed something back from a long decline, and he carried that pride carefully. The way you carry something you've learned the hard way not to take for granted. But he did not ask Arthur for things, and he did not speak easily about the years before the contract. Arthur had learned to read the conversational geography of Jimmy Webb with precision. You could travel freely through the present, carefully through the recent past, and almost not at all through anything before 2012. The years at Callaway Infrastructure Group were in a particular locked room, and Jimmy had never once opened the door to it in Arthur's presence. He had mentioned the old job in that first conversation at the park. I had a real job once, and had not returned to it since. Arthur had not asked him to. This was, I think, the most difficult restraint Arthur exercised during those 3 years. He knew what was in that folder. He knew what Derek had done. He knew that Jimmy's locked room held something Arthur had helped put there by failing to look. Every time he sat across from Jimmy Webb at a table, or stood in the garage talking while Marcus did homework on the workbench, Arthur carried the weight of that knowledge, the way you carry something you've promised yourself you'll put down eventually, but not yet. Not until you understand where to put it. He was working towards something. He just didn't know the shape of it yet. It was in the spring of Marcus's 6th grade year, a Sunday afternoon in April, when Arthur decided to do what he'd been avoiding for 2 years. He drove himself to the office. Not the current offices downtown, where Derek and his team now operated, but the original Callaway building on West Monroe, which Arthur still owned personally and kept partly staffed. He had his own elevator key. He went up to the archive floor, the real archive, the physical one, the rows of fireproof cabinets that went back to the company's founding. He pulled the 2009 and 2010 fleet maintenance files himself. He spread them on the table. He went through them with the focused attention of a man who had once been very good at forensic due diligence and had never entirely lost the skill. What he found took him 4 hours to fully map, and when he was done, the table was covered in documents, and Arthur was sitting very still with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall in front of him. The 3 safety violations attributed to James Webb were real, in the sense that the paperwork existed. But the paperwork had been generated by administrative corrections submitted not by Jimmy's direct supervisor, who had, in fact, given Jimmy the achievement pin review 6 months earlier, but by someone in the VP office. The submission timestamps were irregular. 2 of the 3 were filed retroactively, within the same 72-hour window, 8 months after the incidents they described had allegedly occurred. Arthur had spent enough years reading contracts and records to know what retroactive paperwork, filed in a cluster, looked like. It looked like someone building a file. He picked up the termination approval. Derek's signature. He had been a VP for 2 years at that point. He had been, at the time, trying to consolidate his position in the company, and there had been, Arthur now remembered, a restructuring of the fleet division that same quarter, a cost-cutting exercise that had reduced headcount by 12%. The terminations had been justified on performance grounds. Arthur had approved the general restructuring. He had not reviewed individual terminations at that level. He trusted his VPs. He trusted Derek. He sat there in the archive room with the map of it all spread out in front of him. Jimmy Webb had not been fired for safety violations. Jimmy Webb had been fired because he was on the wrong list at the wrong time, and someone had built the paperwork afterward to make sure there was no trail back. Arthur thought about Jimmy's face when he said, "I had a real job once." The flatness of his voice, the wall he'd put around it. He thought about Marcus on a park bench, 9 years old, deciding not to pick up a wallet that he'd already touched. He thought about the badge. Excellence in service. 6 months before the termination. 2 months before, probably, someone had started building the file. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't look like grief at all. It looks like stillness. It looks like a man sitting in an archive room with papers spread around him, not moving, not crying, not doing anything that would read from the outside as emotional at all. But inside the stillness, something is happening. A recognition, slow and terrible and complete, that a wrong has been living inside a structure you built, invisible to you because you chose not to look at it directly. Arthur had not been complicit in what Derek did, but he had built the company and he had put Derek in the position, and he had not asked questions when he should have asked questions, and the man across town who kept a bronze badge in a box because it was the last good thing the Calloway name had ever meant to his family was the cost of that choice. He sat in the archive room for a long time. Then he called Roland. "I need to talk to you about the estate planning," Arthur said. "Not in the office, somewhere else." "Of course," Roland said carefully. "When?" "This week," Arthur said. "And Roland, don't mention this to anyone, including anyone in the current Calloway structure." Roland paused exactly 1 beat. "Understood," he said. They met on Thursday at Roland's private office in Lincoln Park, away from the firm's main building. Arthur came alone, without Henry, and told Roland what he had found in 4 careful, precise sentences. Then he told Roland what he wanted to do about it. Roland listened without interrupting. He was a careful man, as has been noted, and careful men listen completely before they speak. When Arthur finished, Roland was quiet for a moment. "What you're describing," Roland said, "in terms of the estate adjustment, that's within your complete legal authority to do. That's not in question. The other part, the acknowledgement, the compensation from Mr. Webb, that becomes more complex because it admits institutional liability that the current company structure may contest." "I know," Arthur said. "It could also," Roland said, more gently, "create consequences for the company that outlast you. If Derek contests the estate, and if the liability acknowledgement becomes part of that contest." "I know," Arthur said again. "I'm not asking you to talk me out of it. I'm asking you to make it legally airtight." Roland looked at him for a moment. "I'll need time." "You have it," Arthur said, "but not unlimited time. I want it done before the end of the year." He stood to leave. At the door, he stopped. "Roland," he said without turning around. "The boy, Marcus, he should have something that comes to him when he's old enough to use it well. Not a gift, a trust, structured like a scholarship with broader application, education, a first business investment, whatever he needs. It should be clear in the language that it's for him specifically, and that it's uncontestable." "I'll structure it that way," Roland said. Arthur nodded. He put his hand on the doorframe for a moment, not because he needed support, but the way a man touches something solid when he's made a decision he intends to stand behind. "He's going to be someone," Arthur said. "I'd like to make sure the road isn't harder than it has to be." He left. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday evening, Derek called. Arthur had expected it. He didn't know the trigger, he'd been careful. But Derek had always had an instinct for when the ground under him was shifting. The particular animal awareness of a man who had spent years monitoring his father's moods and decisions for signs of movement. "I heard you met with Roland privately," Derek said. The voice was even, still. The voice of a man who has practiced not sounding like what he is. "I meet with Roland regularly," Arthur said. "He's my attorney. Not at his private office, not without any firm staff present." Arthur looked out the window of his study. It was raining. The street below was quiet. "There are things I haven't looked at closely enough, Derek," Arthur said. He heard his own voice come out very steady and very flat, the way a statement of fact comes out when there is no anger in it yet, only clarity. "Things I should have." I'm addressing that. Silence. What does that mean? Derek asked. It means I'm doing my job, Arthur said, which has always included making sure the people under me were doing theirs. He paused. Get some sleep. We'll talk when there's something to talk about. He ended the call. He sat in his study for a long time after, with the rain against the window and the lamp throwing a warm circle on his desk, and the folder, the real one now, with Roland's notes in the margin, sitting in the centre of it. On the corner of his desk was a photograph, taken at the science fair 3 years ago, that Marcus had given him. Not a formal photograph, but a candid one that Jimmy had snapped on his phone and printed and framed, small, in a cheap frame from the drugstore. Marcus at his bridge project, mid-explanation, arms out, completely absorbed. Arthur in the background, at the edge of the frame, watching with an expression on his face that Arthur hadn't recognized when Marcus first showed it to him. He recognized it now. It was the expression of someone who had unexpectedly found something they had given up looking for. What the file said. The hospital room was on the 8th floor of Northwestern Memorial, north-facing, and on clear days you could see the lake. This was not a clear day. It was February, the sky the particular flat grey of a Chicago winter that has gone on long enough, and the lake was invisible behind a wall of low clouds that had been sitting over the city for 4 days without moving. Arthur had been admitted on a Tuesday. By Thursday, his cardiologist, a careful, honest woman named Dr. Abrams, who did not soften things unnecessarily, had used the phrase significant deterioration, and then, when Arthur pressed her, had used the phrase, we're talking about a matter of months, not years, depending on how the next few weeks go. She said it looking directly at him, which Arthur appreciated more than he could have articulated. He had spent enough time with people who couldn't look him in the eye. Months, Arthur said, possibly longer with very careful management. But I want you to understand the range we're working in. I understand, Arthur said. She left. Arthur lay in the hospital bed in the flat grey light and looked at the ceiling, which was not his ceiling. He thought about the folder on his desk at home, and the documents Roland had been preparing, and the conversation he had not yet had with Jimmy Webb, and the boy who was now 12 and growing fast and asking sharper questions every time Arthur saw him. He called Roland. I need the documents here, he said. All of them, today. Roland arrived at 6 in the evening with a leather portfolio and the particular expression of a man who had been in this situation before and knew what it required of him. He sat in the chair by the bed and opened the portfolio, and they worked for 2 hours, carefully, methodically, going through every clause and condition and legal mechanism that Roland had built over the previous months. The documents were in good shape. Roland was thorough. But there was one section that Arthur kept returning to, the language around the acknowledgement of institutional liability regarding Jimmy Webb's termination. Roland had drafted it carefully, using language that was legally protective enough to limit the company's exposure, while still being clear and specific about what had happened and why it was being addressed. Read me the core language again, Arthur said. Roland read. The Callaway Infrastructure Group, under the leadership of Arthur Callaway, acknowledges that the termination of James Daniel Webb in March 2010 was improperly documented and not supported by legitimate performance grounds. The termination caused material harm to Mr. Webb's professional trajectory and livelihood over a period of years. In acknowledgement of this harm, the estate of Arthur H. Callaway commits to the following compensatory actions. Arthur closed his eyes while Roland read. He was listening not for errors but for truth, for whether the language said what it needed to say with enough plainness that no one who read it, now or 50 years from now, could honestly claim they hadn't understood what it meant. It did. Good, Arthur said. That's good. Leave it as it is. Roland turned to the last section, the trust for Marcus. The language here was different in tone, specific, forward-looking, without the weight of reckoning the other sections carried. It established a trust in Marcus James Webb's name, accessible in full at age 25, or in conditional portions before that for education, business formation, or medical necessity. The amount was substantial, not obscene, but the kind of number that changed the range of what a person could build with their life. "There's one more thing," Arthur said. "I want a letter, separate from the legal documents, not a formal document, a letter for Marcus that he reads when he's old enough." He looked at the ceiling. "I'll dictate it. You'll transcribe and witness." "Of course," Roland said. Arthur dictated the letter that evening, pausing twice. Once to cough, once to look at the window for a long time without speaking before continuing. It was not a long letter. It was not flowery. It said, in the plain language of a man who had built things for 40 years and knew how to spec a load-bearing element. "I found you by accident, which is probably the only way anyone finds the things that matter. You kept a stranger's wallet safe for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. And then you stayed to make sure no one else took it, and that was not a small thing, even if it seemed like one. Your father is a good man who was treated badly by people who should have done better, including me, in the sense that I built the company and hired the people and didn't ask the questions I should have asked. This letter can't undo that, but I want you to know that I knew it, at the end, and I chose to do something about it rather than nothing. That's the best any of us can do. Build things worth building. Hold on to the things worth holding. The badge your father kept. He kept it because it was true, and the truth in it is still true. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Roland finished transcribing and read it back. Arthur listened. "That's right," Arthur said. "That's what it says." He signed the final documents on a Friday morning, 3 weeks into the hospital stay. Dr. Abrams came in afterward with a quiet update. No immediate crisis, but no change in the overall trajectory. And Arthur thanked her and asked if he could have the afternoon without visitors, which was arranged. He lay in the grey light and thought about everything in order. The way he had always organised large things before he filed them. The bench in October, the badge, the background check, the archive room, the files spread across the table. Jimmy's voice saying, "I had a real job once." Marcus in the science fair with his arms out explaining suspension cables. He held it all in sequence and looked at it the way you look at a finished structure before you sign the inspection paperwork. Not admiringly, but checking for load, checking for gaps, checking for anything that would fail under pressure. He found one gap. He had not told Jimmy. He had been preparing to. He had intended to sit down with Jimmy, not in the park, somewhere private, and lay it out plainly before the documents were finalized. But he had put it off, and then his heart had done what it did, and here he was in a hospital bed with the documents signed, and Jimmy Webb still walking around, not knowing what had happened to his own professional life, or that it had been noticed and was being addressed. Arthur asked the nurse to bring his phone. He called Jimmy directly. The call connected on the second ring. "Mr. Calloway." Jimmy's voice carried the particular careful quality it always had when he was adjusting to something unexpected. "I heard you were in the hospital. Marcus told me. We wanted to come, but we didn't." "I'm glad you didn't," Arthur said. "I don't want that. I want to tell you something, and I want to tell it to you directly, and I'd like you to hear me out before you say anything." A beat. "Okay," Jimmy said, Arthur told him. He told him all of it. The archive room, the retroactive paperwork, the termination approval, Derek's signature. He did not cushion it or apologize before he was done. He stated the facts in sequence the way he would have stated them in any professional context, because Jimmy Webb was not someone who needed to be protected from clarity. When he finished, he said, "I'm sorry that it happened. I'm sorry it took me this long to find it, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I should have, before the documents were signed." There was a long silence on the line. "You signed documents," Jimmy said. "Yes." "About this?" "Yes, about you and about Marcus. Roland Fitch, my attorney, will contact you next week with the full details. I wanted you to hear the outline from me first." Another silence. It was not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who had, for a very long time, kept something locked in a room, and someone had just told him the room was unlocked and he could look inside. "I kept that badge," Jimmy said finally. His voice was different now, careful in a different way, the carefulness of someone navigating a feeling they don't have a lot of practice expressing. "Marcus asked me once why I kept it. I told him it was from a good job. Because it was. I was good at that job." "I know," Arthur said. "The record is clear on that. Whatever happened after, your work was above standard. That's documented." A sound came down the line that might have been a breath, or might have been something that started as a breath and changed its mind. "I don't know what to say," Jimmy said. "You don't have to say anything," Arthur said. "Not now. Roland will call on Monday. You can take your time with it." A pause. "How is Marcus?" "Good," Jimmy said, and some of the steadiness came back into his voice when he said it. The way the mention of his son always reoriented Jimmy toward ground he trusted. "He's good. He's been worried about you. Tell him I said he should focus on his schoolwork and not worry about old men in hospitals." "He won't listen to that." "No," Arthur said. "He won't. That's all right." He looked at the flat grey sky through the window. "Jimmy." "Yeah, the badge. It was earned. Whatever came after, that part was real. I want you to know I know that." Another silence. Then, quietly, "Yeah," Jimmy said. "I know." Arthur ended the call. He put the phone on the nightstand. He looked at the window for a long time. He did not cry during the call. He did not cry for another hour, until a nurse came in to check his vitals and found him sitting in the bed with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes wet, looking at the window with the particular expression of a man who has done the last important thing he needed to do and is now simply waiting to see what comes after. "Are you all right, Mr. Calloway?" the nurse asked. "Yes," Arthur said. He looked at her directly. "I think I am." Arthur Calloway died on a Thursday evening, 8 days later, with the lake visible for the first time all month through a break in the clouds, the last light turning the water gold. He was 74 years old. He had built a great deal and understood, at the end, that the most important structures are the ones no one can see from the outside. Roland called Derek the following morning to notify him of Arthur's passing and to inform him that the reading of the will would take place in 2 weeks at Roland's office. He did not share the contents in advance. He did not need to. Derek was quiet for a long time on the call. Then he said, "I want the full documents sent to my legal team before the reading." "That's not how this works," Roland said pleasantly. Derek curt the call. That afternoon, Roland called Jimmy Webb, and then Marcus, who was home from school, who took the call in his bedroom, who sat on the edge of his bed afterward and looked at the badge on his backpack and did not say anything to his father about what had been said on the call. Not yet. Not until he understood what it meant well enough to put it into words. The reading itself was on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after the funeral. Roland's conference room was formal and quiet. A long table, 6 chairs, afternoon light coming through tall windows on the south wall. On one side sat Derek Calloway with 2 attorneys, a woman named Barbara Hecht, who specialized in estate litigation, and a younger man who took notes. On the other side sat Roland and his associate. Jimmy Webb had been asked if he wished to attend. He had said no. He had said, "Whatever it says, you can explain it to me after. I don't need to be in a room watching someone's son find out what his father decided." Marcus, who had been told the broad shape of things by Roland on the phone, went to school that day like any other day, which was either the most mature or the most frightened thing a 12-year-old could do in that circumstance, and possibly both. Roland read. He was thorough. He covered the standard elements of the estate, the properties, the investment portfolio, the charitable allocations, before reaching the sections that mattered most to the people in the room. Derek received his inheritance. It was not nothing. Arthur had not been petty, and the document reflected that. Derek received the family residence, a cash settlement, and a minority stake in the continuing company structure. What he did not receive was the controlling interest he had expected. That went into a management trust with an independent board, with provisions for transition over a 10-year period. Derek's face did not change during this reading. The expression he wore was the same expression he wore in meetings when he was calculating rather than reacting. Very still, very level, the surface of water that is moving very fast underneath. Then Roland read the section on James Webb. He read the language of acknowledgement. He read the words improperly documented and not supported by legitimate performance grounds and material harm to professional trajectory. He read the compensatory commitment, the cash settlement, the formal letter of acknowledgement to be issued under the company's letterhead, the expungement of the termination record, and its replacement with an amended separation documentation of voluntary resignation. He read it steadily, at a pace that allowed every word to be fully heard. Barbara Hecht wrote something on her notepad and slid it to Derek. Derek looked at the notepad, then he looked at Roland. "My father's cognitive capacity at the time of signing," Derek said. "Dr. Abrams has records from that period. I want them subpoenaed." "Your father was fully lucid at the time of signing," Roland said evenly. "I was present. His attending physician was present as a witness. There is a signed capacity assessment in the documentation." He slid a copy across the table. Derek looked at it. He looked at the copy for a long time. "The Webb acknowledgement," Derek said. "It admits liability on behalf of a company I now have a stake in. It acknowledges a historical action," Roland said. "The legal team has structured the language to address historical liability within the estate context. It does not create ongoing liability for the company structure going forward." "That's your reading," Barbara Hecht said. "That's the reading supported by 3 independent opinions from estate law specialists, yes," Roland said pleasantly. He had been pleasant throughout. It was, Arthur had once told him, the most useful tone in a difficult room. "The documents are complete and legally executed. If you wish to contest, the process for that is outlined in the estate filing. But I'd encourage you to review the full documentation before making that decision, because I think you'll find it is quite thorough." Derek pushed back from the table. He stood. He looked at Roland for a moment, and the surface of him, so controlled, so still, showed the smallest fracture, a tension along the jaw, a thing behind the eyes that was not grief and not quite anger, but something older and harder than either. The thing that lives in people who learned early that love came with conditions and decided the conditions were not worth meeting. "He had no right," Derek said, very quietly, "to do this." "He had every right," Roland said just as quietly. "He built it." Derek walked out. His legal team followed. The door closed. Roland sat alone in the conference room for a moment, the documents still spread in front of him, the afternoon light still coming through the south windows. He thought about Arthur in the hospital bed, dictating the letter for Marcus in that flat, careful voice. He thought about the phrase Arthur had used, "the best any of us can do." He gathered the documents into the portfolio, closed it, and called his assistant to schedule the follow-up meeting with Jimmy Webb. The weight of a small badge. The room where it gets said out loud. The meeting happened on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the estate reading. Roland had arranged it at a neutral location, a conference room at a downtown Chicago law firm that neither side had any prior relationship with, chosen for the precise reason that neutral ground matters when the conversation is going to be difficult, and both sides need to be able to look at each other without the weight of someone else's home territory pressing down on them. Derek arrived with Barbara Hecht and the note-taking associate. Jimmy Webb arrived with Roland and a labor attorney Roland had recommended, a woman named Soo-Jin Park, who had spent 15 years in employment litigation and who, Roland had told Jimmy, was very good at staying calm when things got loud. Marcus was not there. He was at school. Jimmy sat across from Derek for the first time in his life, and the experience was strange in a way he had not anticipated, because Derek Calloway looked nothing like what Jimmy had expected, though if he was honest with himself, he didn't know what he'd expected exactly. He had spent years carrying the low-level weight of a professional wrong he couldn't prove and couldn't afford to fight. And the person at the origin of that wrong had been, in his mind, more a force than a face. Now the force had a face, and the face was tired, and the eyes were doing the thing they did in people who are angry in a way they've had a long time to polish into something that looks almost like dignity. "I want to be clear about what this meeting is," Derek said before Roland could open. His voice was very controlled. It was, Jimmy thought, the voice of a man who had practiced controlling it for a very long time. "I'm here as a stakeholder in a company whose reputation is being materially affected by claims made in a legal document that I believe was signed under conditions I intend to contest. I'm not here to—" "Derek?" Sujin Park's voice was quiet and matter-of-fact. "The capacity assessment stands. The document is legally executed. We've reviewed your legal team's initial brief, and the grounds for contest are thin." She set a folder on the table. "I don't say that to be harsh. I say it because I'd like to use the time we have productively." Derek looked at the folder. He did not open it. "What my father accused me of," he said, "was falsifying performance documentation. That is a serious allegation." "It's not an allegation," Roland said. "It's a documented finding. It's an interpretation of documents." "It's timestamps," Roland said. He slid a set of pages across the table. "These are the original submission records from the HR system. The timestamps on incidents 2 and 3 were filed 71 hours apart, 8 months after the dates of the alleged incidents. Your signature is on the termination approval. The direct supervisor's file from the same period includes a note recommending Mr. Webb for a senior classification upgrade." He tapped the page. "These are not interpretations." Derek stared at the pages. "He had a bad attitude," Derek said quietly, almost as though he was saying it to himself rather than to the room. "Webb. He was difficult. He pushed back on scheduling decisions from the VP level. He filed complaints through HR about maintenance protocol changes that I'd approved. He stopped. "He was doing his job," Jimmy said. The room went quiet. Jimmy had not planned to speak. He had told himself in the car on the way over that he would let the lawyers manage this. He had been doing that his whole adult life, letting processes manage things, because he'd learned that when people like him got loud in rooms like this, the loudness became the story, and the actual wrong got buried under it. But he heard Derek say, "bad attitude," and something in him decided it was done managing. "I filed those complaints because the protocol changes were cutting corners on service intervals that affected vehicle safety," Jimmy said. His voice was even. He was not going to let it shake. "I had 6 years of fleet maintenance experience, and I knew what was being skipped and what it would mean if something failed. I brought it through the right channels. I didn't go around anyone. I documented everything correctly." He looked directly at Derek. "Then I got 3 violations on paper that I'd never been verbally warned about, and a termination notice 2 weeks later. And I couldn't fight it because I couldn't afford to fight it, and I had a 3-year-old kid at home. And I had to decide between spending 2 years in a legal process I probably couldn't win, or moving forward and finding a way to keep working." He paused. "I moved forward. I kept working. But I want to be clear. I knew exactly what happened. I just couldn't prove it." He looked at the folder in front of Derek. "Your father could." The silence in the room had a different quality now. It wasn't the silence of 2 sides waiting for the other side to make a move. It was the silence that happens when something true has been said in a room where truth has been uncomfortably scarce. Barbara Hecht was looking at her notepad. The associate had stopped writing. Derek was looking at his hands, which were flat on the table. "He never told me he found the records," Derek said, very quietly. Not to Jimmy, not to Roland, not to anyone specific. Just said into the room. "No," Roland said, "he didn't." A long pause. Derek's jaw tightened once and then released. "What does your client want?" Derek said, his eyes still on the table, his voice still controlled, but something different underneath it now. Not capitulation, not exactly, but a crack, the smallest opening, the place where the wall had been hit often enough to show the stress. The acknowledgement letter issued under company letterhead, Sujin Park said. The amended HR record, the compensatory settlement as specified in the estate documents. She paused. My client is not looking to damage the company's public reputation. He's looking to have his professional record accurately reflect what actually happened. Derek was quiet for a long time. If we issue the letter, he said slowly, in the form specified, what it says about the termination. It says the termination was improperly documented, Sujin Park said. It doesn't name names. It says the company acknowledges an error in the documentation process from that period and is addressing it. Derek looked up at Roland. That's the language. That's the language, Roland confirmed. Another silence. Derek looked at the window. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in March. Grey, determined, halfway through a thaw and not fully committed to it. I want it reviewed by my team before it's issued, Derek said. That's reasonable, Sujin Park said. We can structure a 30-day review window. Derek nodded once. He stood. He did not look at Jimmy. He was almost to the door when he stopped. Just briefly, one hand on the doorframe, his back to the room, and there was a moment, very short, half a breath long, where his shoulders did something that was not quite a shudge, and not quite anything else, but was the kind of thing a body does when it's standing next to a very heavy thing it doesn't know how to put down. Then he walked out. Barbara Hecht stayed behind to exchange paperwork with Roland. The associate collected his notepad and left without making eye contact with anyone. Sujin Park put her hand briefly on the table in front of Jimmy. Not touching him, just a gesture that meant that went as well as it could have, and then went to speak with Roland. Jimmy sat alone in his chair for a moment. He looked at his hands. They were the same hands they'd always been, careful hands, the kind that moved with purpose and without waste. He had not shaken. He was a little surprised to realize that he hadn't. He thought about Marcus at school right now, in a classroom somewhere, pencil moving across a worksheet or a test or a drawing of something he was thinking about, not knowing how this morning had gone. He thought, I'm going to be able to tell him the truth when he asks. That was enough for now. That was, actually, a great deal. One night in March. 2 weeks after the meeting, Jimmy sat at the kitchen table at 11:30 at night with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and the badge in his hand. He'd taken it off Marcus's backpack, carefully, with permission, Marcus asleep down the hall, because he needed to look at it without it being attached to something in motion. He needed it still. It was lighter than it felt. It always had been. A small bronze disc, no bigger than the pad of his thumb, engraved with the Art Deco globe and the words Excellence in Service, and the year and his name on the back, in letters so small you had to turn it to the light to read them. J. Webb. 2 letters and a surname. The whole of him reduced to a stamped initial, which was not reductive, actually. It was specific. It was him. He had carried this thing for 14 years. He had carried it through 2 apartment moves and a rented garage bay and a pickup truck with a cracked dashboard and a hospital room where his wife had gotten smaller and smaller over 18 months, until she wasn't there anymore. And 1,000 mornings when he'd made Marcus's lunch and dropped him at school, and then driven to whatever job was on the list for the day, and put his hands on an engine, and listened for what was wrong, and found it, because he was good at that. He had always been good at that, even when the years had tried to convince him otherwise. He rolled the badge between his fingers. The engraving was still clear. The globe still had its lines. He thought about Arthur Calloway in a hospital bed, dictating something that Jimmy hadn't read yet. Roland had told him there was a letter to be opened when the time felt right, and Jimmy had said okay and put it in a drawer because the time did not feel right yet. He wasn't sure what right would feel like. He suspected he would know it when it arrived, the way you know certain things, not because someone tells you, but because the weight of carrying them changes, just slightly, in your hands. He thought about what he was going to do with the settlement. The practical parts he had worked out already: pay off the truck, get the garage bay on a longer lease, set something aside for Marcus's school costs going forward. The rest he hadn't decided. There was no rush to decide. He set the badge down on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Here is what I think Jimmy Webb was doing in that kitchen at 11:30 at night with a cold cup of coffee. He was letting himself believe it. The part where the truth had been found and named and addressed by the person who had the power to address it. The part where it turned out that being excellent at your job was a matter of permanent record, and not something that could be permanently erased by someone's signature on a termination notice. The part where the thing he'd kept all these years had not been kept out of bitterness or stubbornness, but out of something more durable than either. The quiet, unspectacular certainty that it had been true. He picked the badge back up. He turned it over and looked at Jay Webb in the lamplight. "Yeah," he said quietly to no one. "I know." He put it on the table. He went down the hall. He opened Marcus's door a crack, just to look, the way you look at your kid when they're asleep and the world is quiet enough to see them clearly. Marcus was on his back, one arm flung wide, the particular boneless relaxation of a 12-year-old in deep sleep. His backpack was on the chair by the desk. There was a test paper on the desk with a red B+ at the top, which was good for a regular week and would be better the next time because Marcus would make sure it was. Jimmy stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he closed the door and went to bed. And for the first time in a very long time, the thing he'd been carrying felt more like something worth carrying and less like a weight he hadn't been able to put down. The morning before. 10 years later, Marcus Webb was 19, nearly 20, and standing in the kitchen of the apartment he and his father had moved into 2 years ago. A real apartment, not big, but stable and theirs, with a kitchen table that had room for more than 2 people and a window that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that had always, since the first week, made Marcus feel like the day was starting with something on his side. He was leaving in 3 days. Scholarship to Northwestern's engineering program, structural engineering, with a focus on infrastructure and materials. He had applied and been accepted and cried about it alone in his room in a way he hadn't told his father about, not out of embarrassment, but because some things needed to happen in private first, before they could happen in the world. He had brought the badge down from his room the night before and set it on the kitchen table, and now it was there between his coffee and the Northwestern acceptance letter he'd printed out, even though everything was digital these days. Because some things you needed to hold in your hand. His father came in at 7:15 in the grey t-shirt he wore on mornings he wasn't working early, and stopped when he saw the badge on the table. He sat down, he poured himself coffee, he looked at the badge. "I was thinking," Marcus said, "I want you to keep it while I'm gone." He looked at the table. "It should stay with you." Jimmy picked up the badge. He turned it over once, the way he always did, to see Jay Webb in the lamplight. Even in the morning light it was visible, the 2 small stamped letters. "You sure?" Jimmy said. "Yeah." Marcus wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "I've been thinking about why you kept it, all this time." He looked at his father. "It wasn't because you were holding on to being mad, right? You kept it because it was true, because it said something real happened, even when the paperwork said otherwise." Jimmy was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's why." "Then I need you to hold on to it while I go figure out what true things I'm going to do." Marcus's voice was steady, not trying to be dramatic, just saying what he meant, which had always been his way. The directness that had gotten him called blunt by teachers who didn't know the difference between blunt and honest. "And when I come back, maybe we'll figure out where it goes next." Jimmy set the badge down on the table between them. He looked at it. Then he looked at his son, at the face that had been 9 years old on a park bench in October and was now almost 20, with the same direct eyes and the same unflappable quality that had made him sit next to a sleeping stranger and decide, without drama, that the right thing was to stay. "Your mum would have loved to see this," Jimmy said. His voice was even, but the kind of even that takes some effort. Marcus nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "Tell me something about her," he said. Not the way he used to say it as a kid, urgent, hungry, trying to collect every detail, just, "Tell me something." The ease of someone who knows the story isn't going anywhere, who has time to receive it slowly. Jimmy thought for a moment. She could fix things too, he said. Not cars, but when something was broken, she didn't panic. She just sat with it until she understood what was wrong, and then she figured out how to address it. He paused. You got that from her. Marcus smiled. It was a quiet smile, the kind that happens when something settles rather than surprises. They sat at the kitchen table in the morning light with the badge between them and their coffee getting warm, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the not saying was fine. It was, actually, exactly right. Many years later. The bronze badge stayed on Jimmy Webb's workbench for 6 years while Marcus was at Northwestern, and then working for an infrastructure firm in Chicago, then in Boston for 2 years, then back. When Marcus came back to Chicago for good, which happened gradually, the way most permanent things happen, not as a decision so much as an accumulation of choices that pointed the same direction, he brought his own toolbox and his own certifications and a way of looking at structures and load-bearing systems that was, several people had noted, very precise. He joined a firm that did public infrastructure work, bridges, transit systems, road networks, the kind of work that holds cities together from underneath, the kind of work that most people walk over every day without thinking about, which had always seemed to Marcus like the best kind. The kind where the point is not to be noticed, but to hold. He put the badge on his own desk, eventually. Not on a backpack, he was too old for that, but in the corner of his desk, in a small clip frame his father had bought him the year he graduated. The globe with its Art Deco lines. Excellence in Service. J. Webb. He kept it there, not out of sentiment, or not only out of sentiment. He kept it there because it was true. Because the truth in it was the same truth it had always been, and the years had not diminished it, had in fact confirmed it, the way certain materials confirm their properties under pressure. He kept it there because on the days when the work was hard, or the project was behind, or the client was difficult, he could look at it and remember a man who had been good at his work, in a way that outlasted everything that had been done to obscure it. And sometimes, on the days when Marcus was showing a junior colleague something, the right way to read a load report, the importance of filing your documentation correctly and completely, the specific ethic of double-checking the thing you're most certain about, he would tell them about the bench and the badge and the man who kept it for 14 years, not out of bitterness, but out of something more durable. He never told the story the same way twice, but the end was always the same. He kept it because it was true, and the truth in it was still true. Here's what I think about when I reach the end of this story. Not Arthur Callaway exactly, not the documents or the meeting in the conference room, or even the letter in the drawer that Jimmy finally opened on a Sunday morning, 2 years after Arthur died, when the time had quietly become right without announcing itself. I think about a 9-year-old boy in a navy blue hoodie, sitting on a bench in Grant Park in October, with a worksheet on his knee and a pencil he kept tapping against his thumbnail. The moment his fingers closed around the edge of a wallet that wasn't his, and then the moment he put it back. And then, the moment he decided to stay. He didn't know anyone was watching. He didn't know the old man on the bench had been testing people for 2 years, or that there was a file somewhere in an archive, or that a badge on his backpack connected 2 families across a decade of silence. He just knew it was right to stay, in the particular uncomplicated way that children sometimes know things before they've been taught to doubt them. That's the thing about that bench, and about that afternoon, that I can't let go of. It wasn't the wallet. It wasn't even the man on the path. It was the staying. The ordinary, unremarkable, completely unnecessary act of remaining in a place where you don't have to be, because something that needed protecting was there, and you were there too, and that seemed like enough of a reason. Some structures are visible, some aren't. The ones that hold the most weight are often the ones you don't see until something pushes against them. Marcus Webb became an engineer who built things that hold. His father became a man who got to watch that happen. Arthur Callaway, who built half of Chicago's skyline and trusted almost none of the people who helped him do it, died in a hospital room looking at the lake, having spent the last years of his life trusting one small family with his whole intact heart. The badge is still there on the desk. The globe, the lines, the 2 stamped letters. Still true. If this story reached you today, wherever you're watching from, thank you for staying until the end. That's something worth saying. If Marcus's story or his dad's story made you feel something, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need it. And if you want to be here for the next one, you know what to do. Hit subscribe, because the next story is already waiting. Take care of each other. We'll see you soon.